George was far more interested in doing it because it was the right thing to do.
He was sort of the golden boy. He had it all. He was articulate, he was comfortable about the positions he was staking out. He took risks. He took political risks. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a soul like me. I was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
I've got to go. I have someone outside waiting for me. And I hop a phone, and in rushes Eric Sheck, a staff member, screaming that George Moscone has just been shot. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it.
The neighborhood problems are the city's problems.
Dan White had been a lost and troubled soul on the Board of Supervisors, resisting many changes the mayor, Harvey Milk, and others proposed.
George was certainly was no saint. He liked to drink, he liked to have a good time. But he was, you know, you always could trust him, we thought. Some guy like Dan White comes along and he doesn't trust him. Because Dan White was wired to not trust anybody.
I knew Dan White. He had been a fireman with my brother. He had been a police officer. He didn't last too long at any of his jobs. And so it didn't surprise me when he didn't last very long on the Board of Supervisors.
He didn't like to see, you know, gays in positions of authority particularly. He didn't like all the integration stuff too much. He was a terrible politician. He was rigid. You know, you got to compromise if you're going to be a politician. Dan White didn't believe that.
Dan was a mean, nasty guy. He wanted to be a politician. He wanted to be liked, and he wanted to be gregarious and generous as the other politicians he saw around him, like Harvey and George. But he didn't have it in him.
Dan White was the only supervisor to vote against Harvey Milk's gay rights bill, which Moscone enthusiastically signed. White also resisted efforts to integrate the San Francisco police and fire departments.
So both the San Francisco Police and Fire Department were essentially lily white organizations and lily white male organizations. There were, you know, scattering of minority members, but, you know, not to speak of.
And a federal court found that the city was vulnerable and that they had to change hiring practices. And that's a big thing when it comes to a uniformed force, and both police and fire.
Moscone worked hard to negotiate a consent decree with the federal government, under which the city would agree to an integration plan. The Police Officers Association and Dan White were furious. Shortly before a trial was to begin, the Board of Supervisors rejected the settlement 6-5, with White delivering the 6th vote. But then came a shocking turn of events.
Dan White walked in and said he wanted to see the mayor. So while he was waiting to be escorted into the mayor's office, he and I chatted a while, and I said, "How are things?" He said, "Well, they're okay, but I'm going to resign." And I was obviously taken aback. And he said, "Yeah, I just can't make it anymore on this salary, and, you know, I've got a young family, and, you know, and plus I don't, you know, this political game is really not one that I'm comfortable in." So Dan was escorted in to see the mayor, and he told him of his decision, and that day was the last time that I ever saw Dan White.
The mayor accepted White's letter of resignation on Friday, November 10th, 1978. That Monday, the board made it official. The clerk removed White's name from his office door.
Dan White resigned, and shortly after that, Congressman Leo Ryan and his party boarded a plane for Jonestown to look into the reports about the People's Temple and the concerns that people were being held there without their will.
The year before, when investigative reporters Marshall Kilduff and Phil Tracy wrote an expose in New West magazine of corruption and physical abuse at the People's Temple, Jim Jones and his followers had fled the city for a remote jungle compound in Guyana.
Soon thereafter, that horrible tragedy occurred, and of course, because so many of the people who committed suicide were San Franciscans, there was absolute horror. It was just a horrible time in San Francisco history.
Well, the bodies of at least 409 men, women, and children, some shot to death, most apparently self-poisoned, have been found at the Guyana jungle camp of People's Temple. Among the bodies were those of the temple's fanatical founder, the Reverend Jim Jones, his wife, and at least one of their children.
In the end, the death toll was 909. The minister who had helped liberal politicians get elected was now revealed as a monster. The city was traumatized. Moscone was distraught. While the city mourned, Dan White suddenly announced he wanted his job back.
When Dan White resigned, he was under heavy pressure from the police department because he was a 6 vote that would be against the consent decree. And that may be what led directly to the Moscone assassination.
And then White came in and said, I want my job back within a few days of quitting. And Moscone's scratching his head, why would I give you your job back, Dan? I have an opportunity to rename somebody, put somebody there to my liking, and you had already shown you wanted to step down.
White learned on a Sunday that Moscone was not going to reappoint him. The next morning, 3 days after Moscone's 49th birthday, Dan White came to City Hall armed with a revolver and climbed in through a basement window to avoid the metal detector at the door. He went to the mayor's office, asked for a meeting, and was invited into a small private room behind the main office. There, he shot and killed George Moscone. White then walked across City Hall and reloaded his gun before entering Harvey Milk's office, where he shot the supervisor 5 times.
As president of the Board of Supervisors, it's my duty to make this announcement. Both Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk have been shot and killed. The suspect is Supervisor Dan White.
White was quickly apprehended, booked, and held for trial. That night, 30,000 people marched to City Hall in an outpouring of grief.
Thousands and thousands of people, almost all of them holding small candles. A spontaneous march formed fewer than 8 hours after the assassinations of Harvey Milk and George Moscone.
Well, I've never gotten over the loss of Moscone. And every time I go to San Francisco, I miss him so much, you know.
What's his legacy? That's like, you know, these days, they said in Westminster Abbey about Christopher Wren. He wanted his legacy, look around you. But it's a sense of inclusiveness that we're all kind of San Francisco people here. And we're all going to get along.
I think George Moscone sometimes gets short shrift for his accomplishments, particularly in the LGBT community. Partly, I think that's because of his proximity to Harvey Milk, who, you know, really has achieved a kind of iconic status as a martyr to gay rights. And in some ways that overshadows what Moscone accomplished.
My dad was the first one to open the door.
he pushed the door open and he kept them open and they never closed. And I think that the flow into and out of the halls of power changed so dramatically because of my dad.
Well, I think San Franciscans are lucky to have had what I call the people's mayor, a guy that really loved people. What he showed the world was this affection and this interest in getting to the bottom of what hurts you.
The city not only just personally lost a great leader, but he could have done a lot more if he'd stuck around, if he'd been allowed to flourish as a leader, to move San Francisco along in a positive way. And I think that's the tremendous political loss that his departure leaves.
Whether it was in San Francisco or Sacramento, or what he tried to do statewide and then came back as the mayor of the city, he was a courageous leader who thought in an entrepreneurial, fresh way about how to go forward. And it was really a tragedy for our city when his career was cut short. Who knows where he might have gone from there.
The job of mayor of San Francisco is the most exciting position that any person could ever aspire to. I have never felt more fulfilled in my life. There cannot be anything that's more exciting. State Senate's a delightful job. I enjoyed 9 years there, but it's no comparison. This is a great job.